There is a herd mentality in American politics, a conventional wisdom that's frequently but not always right. In this instance, there was so much hatred of Donald Trump and so much incredulity about whether he could win that the punditry unanimously decided that Hillary was going to win, notwithstanding polls that were all moving in Trump's direction. What did I see? I saw Hillary very weak. I saw Hillary without a campaign message. And I saw Trump with a clear message and a clear level of energy and enthusiasm, notwithstanding some of the speed bumps his campaign hit.
In the days and months leading to the 2016 presidential election, Doug Schoen, a man who had worked closely at the side of the Clinton family from the days of the Bill Clinton White House, with an impeccable resume studying at elite institutions and helping poll for and advise fixtures of the political establishment for decades, from his base in the echo chamber that is New York City, in articles and media appearances, expressed a view of the political reality and what was going to transpire in the victory of Donald Trump that virtually all of his peers lacked. That someone so ensconced in the world Doug has operated in as a pioneering pollster and campaign consultant primarily for Democratic candidates could analyze the situation objectively is a testament to a clarity in thinking and an intellectual honesty that is rare in the world of political punditry and prognostication. More than his keen political insights, his unparalleled experience advising presidents and prime ministers, and his penetrating insight, I'm proud to call Doug a mentor and a friend. He's a mensch in the truest sense of that term. As you're about to hear in our conversation, Doug and I disagree on any number of issues, but he is always cordial, respectful, and well-reasoned. At core, he loves America, and he believes in freedom and the imperative to protect that freedom. He is a liberal in the mold of John F. Kennedy rather than a progressive, and that has made him more and more marginalized in his own party, in my view, regrettably. But it's a testament to Doug's character that he sticks to his beliefs, even if it's not necessarily in his political self-interest to do so. In short, Doug is probably my favorite Democrat. I wanted to have him on the podcast to draw out some of his lessons from a life well spent as a practitioner and student of politics, to share his insider view and how it has impacted his political philosophy, and to discuss his strong beliefs in the threats that face us, both globally in terms of China and Russia, and at home in terms of the bloat of government, rot in our institutions, and our inability to share in a common vision for America. Before we begin, I wanted to thank everyone who has listened to and shared this podcast. This show is a labor of love. It consists of a staff of one, and it's really made the launch a success, and it's made the efforts that I've put into this feel worthwhile. If you like the conversation you're about to hear and you find it valuable, I hope that you'll consider subscribing to the podcast and rating and reviewing it, whether in the iTunes store or wherever else you're listening to us. I'm really most grateful for your support. And if you want to find out more about the show, you can visit the website at benweingarten.com/bigideas and follow me on Twitter at BHWeingarten. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Doug Schoen. Doug, you've had a fascinating career in the political realm as a practitioner and someone that understands how human beings think, because so much of politics is how do you appeal to an audience, what is an audience driven by, and you're also an intellectual. And it's hard to find people in life who are both tremendous practitioners and also deep thinkers. Speak a little bit to your ideological journey in life.
Sure. Well, I started as a fairly conventional liberal Democrat. I always understood the need, indeed the obligation, to build broader coalitions, but I think as a child of the civil rights movement, I was somebody who applauded the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, expansion of the social safety net more generally. However, what I came to realize working for Bill Clinton is that politics, especially in a divided country, required a much greater degree of compromise than ever had crossed my mind. The problem with that is our society, as I have written and said, has gotten hopelessly divided. We're totally polarized, and like on immigration now, there's no willingness to compromise. So what I have tried to do in my political work and certainly in my writings is to make the case for centrism, to make the case for a third party, independent candidates, and most of all, compromise on the major issues and challenges facing our country.
Would you say that the political divisions or the partisan divisions are more driven by ideology or actually personality? So in other words, that people associate certain policies with virtue or morality or being a good person, and if you happen to be on the other side of an issue, it becomes a proxy for you're a bad person, and hence the acrimony and division.
Well, it is certainly the case that we personalize our differences. It's certainly the case, particularly as a formerly liberal to moderate Democrat who's prepared to embrace some but not all conservative solutions, that has led me to be demonized. And it certainly is the case that as that polarization has occurred, our ability to come together as a nation and as two political parties has necessarily gotten limited.
And as you mentioned, formerly liberal, and I would describe your views, having read so much of your work, as sort of a Scoop Jackson Democrat or a JFK Democrat. Maybe you would quibble with those descriptors. Given that's the case, but where your party is today, where the energy is with progressives, and I don't think you would ever describe yourself as a progressive, are you a man without a party at this point?
Well, in a certain sense, I would say yes. Look, I'm still a registered Democrat. I vote in Democratic primaries, and I want moderate to centrist candidates to emerge in Democratic primaries. That being said, where the Democratic Party is today is not where I am. I am a pro-growth, low-tax, pro-capitalism Democrat, and you don't hear too many Democrats talking that way. I'm also for a strong national defense. I identify with John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural. I identify with the policies that Scoop Jackson pursued, and I recognize that this makes me isolated in the Democratic Party. The problem is I do not associate myself with the Republicans and Donald Trump and some of the more extreme positions that people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller take on issues like immigration. I completely distance myself from.
You've advised people who have risen further than anyone in politics, presidents, prime ministers, other senior members of executive administrations. Those who rise highest in politics, in your experience, are they primarily driven by power or ideology? Or stated differently, do they care about ideology only insofar as it's a means to power?
You know, I found, Ben, and I think this, in a certain sense, validates my work, that they care about both power and ideology. It's rare that I see somebody who doesn't have a philosophical core. Now, to rise to a high level in politics, you have to be ambitious, you have to seek power, and you have to be willing to make the appropriate accommodations to do that. But that being said, I've been pleasantly surprised that virtually all the candidates I've had, whether I agree with them or not, have worldviews.
Does what you've seen in your life and your career in politics make you more skeptical of government power or less skeptical?
Probably more skeptical with less confidence in government. I am a great believer in the social safety net, but when I hear about the massive waste in social programs, abuses, a permanent government, it's very hard not to support at least some of the claims of the right that there needs to be a greater degree of efficiency in government. Now, Donald Trump literally this week announced a reorganization and an arguable streamlining of the federal government. Rather than just immediately embracing it, my attitude is, what's this going to do to programs? How are people going to be impacted? But at the same time, I am one of those who believes that our workforce is bloated, that there's inefficiency, and that government is probably the least effective way to achieve many of our social ends.
In your experience, is it possible to rise to the highest levels of government in politics without compromising your principles?
I would say most politicians understand they have to compromise. It may be a rhetorical compromise, it may be a substantive compromise, but I think they all recognize it because being ideologically pure really only works at the extremes of both parties, and while they've had greater success, there are very few politicians I've seen who've been able to just say, don't tell me what is politically expedient, I'll tell you what I want to do.
Growing up in a conservative household in the 90s, my distinct recollection is that the name Bill Clinton was sort of a slur in our house for any number of reasons, ideological and otherwise. Studying him as I've gone on in life, I've understood and recognized him to be a master political practitioner who understood how to take complex issues and explain them in a way that was compelling for the layman and to touch people in a way that most politicians simply don't have that charisma. Now, some of that is natural gifts and some of it is teachable. What are the teachable traits of Bill Clinton that you saw?
Well, one of the points that I would make is Bill Clinton ran in a lot of elections. Governors in Arkansas would run every 2 years. He started running for governor, if I got this right, I think in, what was it, 78, I think. He was elected, he lost in 80 and reclaimed the office in 82 and then ran every 2 years to 90 when he was reelected for the last time. Then I can't quickly do the count there, but having been elected Attorney General and having run unsuccessfully for Congress, Bill Clinton had run 12, 13 times before he ran for president. He also is a very warm guy, and he figured out that by touching people's lives in a meaningful way, he'd make more impact than just quickly shaking hands. So I learned a lot about politics from him, and he was somebody who had a worldview, it evolved, and he compromised.
You've also written extensively about Richard Nixon, who I think is another figure that you can learn just a lifetime of political lessons from studying, and he's much maligned based upon how his presidency ended. But there's so much to his career from the fact that he was down and out of politics and kicked to the curbside, and then ended up rising to the presidency in a miraculous sort of fashion. What are the great lessons of Nixon's career?
Well, look, Nixon was a brilliant political analyst, not a particularly good candidate. But having lost in 1962 for governor of California after losing to John F. Kennedy in 1960, he was pronounced dead. He was reelected in 68, running with effectively a plan to end the war in Vietnam and a notion that he would pursue a different set of policies than Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. In fact, he institutionalized much of the Great Society, all the while campaigning as a cultural and economic conservative. But at the same time, there was more school integration under Richard Nixon than anyone else. We started the Equal Opportunity Commission, black capitalism, the Clean Air Act. So there were bold initiatives and accomplishments in domestic policy, but between détente with the Russians, the first successful approach to the Chinese, arms control agreements, the Nixon administration was preeminent in foreign policy. He also created a backlash against his moderation. At the same time, was a model for what Bill Clinton ultimately did later. All of which is a quick way to say Nixon shaped politics in a way that led me to write that he was probably the preeminent political actor of the second half of the 20th century.
Since you mentioned Nixon going to China, a pivotal move in world history. Obviously, everyone recognizes the material benefits that that relationship has provided to us, and that there have been some benefits to the America and the West interacting with and integrating with China. On the other hand, there's a downside as well, which is that China has, of course, stolen billions of dollars in intellectual property from us, and we've essentially recapitalized a formerly basket case, communist-run economy. Maybe we can't opine as to who won in this bargain over time, but how do you see the net benefit versus cost of the opening with China?
Well, and there's a third thing that I would say, which is that the expansionist nature of the Chinese policies, both in the South China Sea, in Asia more generally, and indeed in particularly Africa and Latin America, means that they have been expansionist in a way that we have not been able, at least in my judgment, to successfully challenge them. There's one other thing, Ben, which is to me profoundly troubling. We've given up on human rights. I mean, China is one of the worst offenders, and we've sort of ignored it. Not sort of, we have. And to my way of thinking, they've probably been the winners vis-a-vis us, but since it's not a zero-sum game and it's not a question of who wins and who loses, we have maintained the peace. We have avoided conflict with them, but at substantial cost.
What do you think China ultimately wants? Do they want to be the world hegemon? Do they want to be able to act with complete impunity and not be afraid that the U.S. will counter them?
I think they do want to be the world hegemon, certainly in their realm. They do, in Asia and South China Sea. I think they are increasingly confrontational. They have been working, as I said in one of my books, with the Russians successfully. And I think that the Chinese are looking to institutionalize and evolve the Communist Party for another 50 years. I think they're looking to deal with their own economic problems, their own environmental problems, and their own social problems without jeopardizing basic societal organization.
Since you mentioned the Russian-Chinese relationship, you and I share the view that Russia is a major adversary, regardless of the ending of the Cold War. Unlike after World War II, it wasn't as if Russia purged its ranks of all the people who were involved in the mass slaughters and the intelligence dictatorship that they built before. They just kind of changed their uniforms a little bit. And we're both profoundly afraid about, obviously, espionage operations and Russia building wedges throughout the world to undermine our influence and to increase their influence in Europe and the like. All that being said, what we've seen in terms of what Russia did in the 2016 election versus the reaction to it, and as the days go on, you know, we have FISA abuse, informants in a presidential campaign, leaks, game playing with redactions, stonewalling of documents, alleged modifications of 302s, all of the events that have transpired relating to Russia, the use of a dossier which consisted of information gleaned from probably Russian agents in effect. What is worse, what Russia has done or what we've done to ourselves?
Well, I think there's a link between the two. My view is, yes, the Russians wanted to elect Donald Trump, but I think they had a larger goal, which was to disrupt our country and our politics. And on that, I think they've won. I think they've done to us what we have been unsuccessful in doing in most places, which is to destabilize our political system. The whole fight that you were alluding to is in large measure over things the Russians initiated, and we really don't know as we sit here today how much they did and ultimately how much impact they had, not only on our political system, but on the outcome of our election. I'm not sitting here today saying they elected Donald Trump, but I'm sure not saying that they had no impact at all and this was just a sideshow.
A lot of the talk among the kind of law enforcement and intelligence establishment is about protecting the institutions. And I would suggest, and I assume you would agree, especially in light of the recent IG report and the subsequent IG reports that we will see and further probes in Congress, that the way to protect the institutions is for the institutions to act with integrity. That said, what do you believe the ultimate ramifications are for our national security, given the clear corruption and politicization that we've seen only to date, with so much more to come?
Well, I am very, very worried about our institutions. Frankly, more than I'm worried about the outcome of the Mueller investigation. I mean, I'm one of those who doesn't say close it down. I say, let's see what he's got. Let's see if Michael Cohen did go to Prague. Let's see if there was any collusion. Let's see what we can learn about Paul Manafort. Let's see all that. But to date, we haven't seen any evidence of collusion. What we have seen clear evidence of is an FBI from the director on down that were making decisions clearly not on the merits. And while there are thousands of good FBI agents out there, there's clearly a lot of decisions, particularly with regard to Hillary Clinton and the emails, that were, as Inspector General Michael Horowitz said, not in accord with Justice Department procedure.
Returning to politics now, I looked back at some of the articles that you wrote, published prior to the 2016 presidential election, and in the run-up, you were very prescient in saying Hillary has things to be concerned about. Things are not trending in the right direction. Meanwhile, virtually the entire world of political punditry would have been on the other side of that argument, and they said it's a cakewalk. What did you see that they missed? And should we trust the quote-unquote experts if they don't necessarily understand the movement that's on the other side of a campaign?
Well, there is a herd mentality in American politics, a conventional wisdom that's frequently but not always right. In this instance, there was so much hatred of Donald Trump and so much incredulity about whether he could win that the punditry unanimously decided that Hillary was going to win, notwithstanding polls that were all moving in Trump's direction. What did I see? I saw Hillary very weak. I saw Hillary without a campaign message, and I saw Trump with a clear message and a clear level of energy and enthusiasm, notwithstanding some of the speed bumps his campaign hit.
What is the greatest threat to America internationally?
Russia and China individually and collectively facilitating and indeed perhaps encouraging actions by rogue nations and terrorist groups.
And what is the greatest threat to America domestically?
Ourselves. Our greatest threat is us against one another. I have always, as you know, Ben, had great respect and admiration for you, both as a thinker and as a person, but it is rare to be able, as somebody who disagrees with you on a lot of issues, to have as constructive a dialogue as we've already had, and I dare say a friendship and a sense of respect that has grown out of that. And I say that because it is very rare, if not unique, in American politics for those kind of bonds, intellectual and I dare say personal, to be formed.
Well, the fact of the matter is that if you're going to be intellectually honest, you have to listen to the best that the other side can put out. And in your career, I'm sure that you've understood many conservative interlocutors better than they've understood themselves.
Well, what I've tried to do is understand the problem first and whether the solution and the analysis appended to the solution makes sense, regardless of ideology, rather than using ideology as the template for everything.
What are the outlets and or who are the commentators that you read on a daily basis?
You know, I'm going to defer any specific answer to say I try to get a diversity of opinion and a diversity of arguments and then reach conclusions. But there's no one or two. I mean, I like Tom Friedman. I like Peggy Noonan. I like David Brooks. I like Ross Douthat. Those are people I like, but sometimes I'll react badly to what they write. Sometimes I'll react well. Sometimes not at all.
What are the books that had the greatest impact on your life and career?
Boy, as I'm sitting here now, I am not reaching a conclusion about individual books, but some of the work of people like Sam Huntington, James Q. Wilson, Banfield, some of Kissinger's work has impacted my thinking, but I don't have one person or group of people that I would point to readily.
In a prior interview, I talked to Andrew Clavin, who you might know, and he saw in my bookcase Robert Caro's The Power Broker. What do you think about The Power Broker and Caro generally?
When I was about, I think, 16 or 17, Power Broker came out. And as you know, I've been very involved in New York politics. I read that book voraciously, and I learned more about New York politics and life from that book than anything I've ever read. I would also say, since you mentioned Bob Caro, I remember reading his second book. I read his first book on Johnson's rise. I read his second book on Johnson in the Senate. And my reaction to that was, I don't think I'm going to be too interested in this. And it was riveting. Absolutely riveting how he forged those compromises that led to the social programs and social initiatives of the 1960s. So I'm not going to say Caro influenced my thinking, but I would say that I learned a great deal from him and what he was able to do, putting aside what I've learned from him, which is enormous, is to collect broad masses of data and then see patterns in them and analyze them. That is, I happen to think of Robert Moses as a much more effective and positive person than Caro does. But that doesn't matter for the analysis. To put it another way, I think it probably made sense to build the Cross Bronx Expressway. You probably could have done more to resettle people who lived in the West Bronx. But that being said, his account of that was something that I had never known and consider myself fortunate to learn. Or the building of the, the Northern State out to Jones Beach and having overhangs that were sufficiently low that buses and trucks couldn't quite fit. I mean, things like that really, as you can see, they're enduring.
Doug, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do help us out by subscribing to, rating, and reviewing Big Ideas with Ben Weingarten in the iTunes Store or wherever else you're listening to us. I'm your host, Ben Weingarten. You can find out more about the podcast at benweingarten.com/bigideas or at BHWeingarten on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time.